When you didn't fight back, when you didn't defend yourself, explain yourself, or try one last time to make them understand, you weren't being weak. You were doing something far more decisive. You were ending the psychological contract without announcing it. And that's what most people don't understand about avoidant dynamics. Avoidants are not disrupted by anger. They're not even disrupted by confrontation. In fact, they often expect it. Conflict keeps them in familiar territory. It gives them a role. It gives them movement without intimacy. But silence, real silence, removes the entire game board. An avoidant nervous system is calibrated around control through distance. Not dominance in the traditional sense, but regulation. When things get emotionally close, they pull away. When the other person reacts, chases, questions, or protests, it reassures them that the bond still exists on their terms. That emotional feedback loop tells them, I can retreat and you'll stay. So when you didn't argue, didn't send long messages, didn't demand closure, something deeply unsettling happened. There was no signal coming back, no emotional echo, and the brain reads that not as calm, but as final. Psychologically, silence after emotional withdrawal is interpreted as abandonment of the role, not just the relationship. You weren't participating anymore. And for an avoidant, that's not neutral. It's destabilizing. Because without your reaction, they lost the ability to regulate themselves through distance. The strategy stopped working. And when a long-used strategy fails, the mind doesn't calmly adapt. It panics internally. Here's the deeper philosophical layer most people miss. When you didn't fight back, you demonstrated self-containment. You showed that your sense of self did not depend on being understood, validated, or chosen in that moment, and that directly confronts an avoidant's unconscious belief system. Avoidants often learned early that closeness costs something, that intimacy requires performance, sacrifice, or eventual loss. So they rely on independence as armor. But when they see someone else walk away peacefully, without collapse, without emotional chaos, it contradicts the story they've been living inside. Your silence wasn't emptiness. It was completeness. And completeness is threatening to someone who equates connection with loss of control. What really shook them was this. You didn't try to prove your worth. You didn't negotiate for space in their life. You didn't explain how deeply you felt or how much effort you had already given. You simply removed yourself. And in doing that, you redefine the power dynamic without saying a word. Because power isn't who cares less. It's who can walk away without self-betrayal. For the avoidant, this creates a delayed psychological impact. At first, they may feel relief, no conflict, no demands, no pressure. But then the absence settles in differently. There's no unresolved tension to revisit, no emotional thread to pull on later, no guarantee that they can re-enter when it's convenient. That's when the mind starts looping. Not because they suddenly became emotionally secure, but because the usual exits no longer exist. Silence also forces accountability in a way words never can. When you argue, you give them something to push against, reinterpret, or minimize. When you explain, you give them material to rationalize. But when you leave quietly, there is nothing to distort. The mind fills the gap with one question it cannot escape. What did I lose? And unlike confrontation, that question doesn't fade, it grows. This is why not fighting back felt like a rupture to them. You didn't escalate, you didn't dramatize, you didn't punish. You ended participation, and psychologically that communicates a truth louder than any speech ever could. I respect myself enough to stop investing where I am not met. And here's the part I want you to hear clearly, because this is where your power actually lives. You didn't leave to make a statement. You left because something inside you aligned, and alignment is irreversible. Once someone senses that you're no longer abandoning yourself, they realize something profound. They didn't push you away. You stepped forward into your own life. You didn't fight back because there was nothing left to fight for. You left because you were finally fighting for yourself. When you left without drama, without ultimatums, without emotional theatrics, something very specific happened inside the avoidant nervous system. You didn't just end a relationship, you removed uncertainty. And uncertainty is where avoidants feel safest. They know how to survive ambiguity. They know how to keep doors half open, conversations unresolved, emotions suspended in midair. What they don't know how to handle is finality. Because finality forces the mind to accept consequences instead of managing distance. Avoidants often confuse emotional chaos with connection. Raised in environments where closeness was unpredictable, overwhelming, or conditional, they learned that intensity equals danger and distance equals safety. So they can tolerate arguments. They can tolerate tension. They can even tolerate pain if it stays familiar. But your calm exit did something entirely different. It removed the possibility of negotiation. And psychologically, that lands as a threat to their most deeply held survival strategy. Here's the crucial distinction. Avoidants aren't most afraid of intimacy. That's the surface narrative. What they're actually afraid of is irrelevance. Being needed but not chosen. Being wanted but not essential. Being close yet not central. When you left without trying to convince them to stay, you signaled something devastating to that internal framework. You demonstrated that your life could continue without them occupying a pivotal role. That's why this kind of departure hits so hard. Anger still implies attachment. Protest still implies hope. Emotional reactions still keep the bond alive. But neutrality, peace, quiet resolve, that communicates emotional independence, and emotional independence tells the avoidant mind, I am not the center of this person's emotional world. For someone who unconsciously relies on others orbiting around them while they keep a safe distance, that realization cuts deep. From a neurological standpoint, their attachment system experiences this as a delayed shock. At first, there may be relief. The pressure is gone. The expectations disappear. No one is asking them to show up emotionally. But then the nervous system searches for the familiar pattern, and it's not there. No messages, no conflict, no reactivity. And that's when the deeper attachment wound activates, not in panic, but in emptiness. That emptiness is where the real work begins, and where most avoidants have never learned how to stay. Because emptiness can't be managed through withdrawal. It demands reflection. It asks questions that distance can't silence. And the most unsettling question is not, why did they leave? It's, why didn't they need me to stay? Philosophically, this moment challenges an avoidant's core identity. Many avoidants build their sense of self around autonomy, self-sufficiency, and emotional control. But when someone leaves calmly, without collapsing or clinging, it reveals a mirror they didn't expect, another person embodying those same qualities, without emotional avoidance. You didn't chase closeness. You chose self-alignment. And that reframes the entire narrative. Your departure wasn't rejection in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet declaration of self-respect. And self-respect is destabilizing to someone who has learned to feel powerful through emotional detachment. Because detachment only works when the other person stays emotionally engaged. Once you disengage with dignity, the detachment loses its leverage. This is why avoidants often revisit these relationships in their minds long after they end. Not because they suddenly became emotionally expressive, but because something unresolved remains. There was no explosion to blame, no chaos to justify the ending, no narrative where you were too much. Instead, there's a clean ending that forces one uncomfortable truth. They didn't lose you because intimacy was impossible. They lost you because they didn't step forward when it mattered. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in quiet moments, in absence, in comparison, in the slow recognition that someone once offered closeness without force and walked away without bitterness. That contrast becomes impossible to ignore. So understand this clearly. You didn't trigger their wound by leaving. You revealed it by leaving calmly. You didn't punish them. You didn't abandon them. You showed them what secure self-respect looks like, and that's what made the loss irreversible. You didn't walk away in anger. You walked away in alignment, and alignment is what their nervous system was never prepared to lose. When you left, something fundamental collapsed in their internal structure, and it wasn't the relationship itself. It was the belief that they were in control. Avoidants often don't seek control in obvious ways. They don't dominate conversations or issue demands. Their control is quieter, more psychological. It lives in timing, distance, and emotional unpredictability. They believe that by pulling back, by staying slightly unavailable, they dictate the rhythm of connection. And for a long time, that strategy works, especially with people who are emotionally generous. But the moment you chose yourself and walked away, you exposed something they never questioned, that their sense of control depended on your participation. It was never absolute. It was conditional. And once you withdrew your consent to the dynamic, the entire structure lost its power. Here's what's important to understand. Avoidants often confuse endurance with attachment. When someone stays through inconsistency, mixed signals, or emotional withdrawal, the avoidant mind interprets that as proof of leverage. Not maliciously, but neurologically. the nervous system learns I can pull away and the bond remains intact. Over time, this becomes an unconscious expectation, not entitlement, but assumption, and assumptions are fragile. They shatter the moment reality stops confirming them. Your exit didn't provoke a fight. It removed the illusion. You didn't challenge their behavior. You made it irrelevant, and psychologically, irrelevance is far more threatening than criticism. Criticism still centers them. It keeps them in the role of the decider. But when you left, you stopped orienting your emotional world around their availability. That's when the power dynamic reversed. What really unsettled them was not that you left, but how you left. There was no bargaining, no last attempt to secure reassurance, no effort to control the outcome. That signaled a level of self-possession they didn't anticipate. And self-possession is destabilizing to someone who believes they manage closeness by staying detached. From a philosophical perspective, control is an illusion rooted in fear. Avoidants often learned early that vulnerability leads to loss, so they try to stay one step ahead emotionally. But your departure demonstrated something they couldn't rationalize away. That connection is not maintained through distance, and influence is not the same as power. You showed that real power lies in choice, not in withdrawal. This creates a psychological lag effect. At first, the avoidant may feel unbothered, even superior. They left, but I didn't chase. But that feeling erodes once the mind realizes there is no re-entry point, no emotional tether to pull on later, no familiar signal that says, I can come back when I'm ready. The door wasn't slammed, it was closed with clarity, and clarity eliminates control. Silence in this context becomes the loudest message, not the silence of manipulation, but the silence of self-direction. You weren't waiting, you weren't watching, you were moving forward, and the avoidant mind struggles with that, not because it wants you back immediately, but because it can no longer predict you. Control depends on predictability. When predictability disappears, anxiety takes its place. This is where the internal reckoning begins. They replay interactions, not to romanticize them, but to locate the moment they lost leverage. And that moment is always the same when you stop trying, not because you gave up, but because you grew out of the dynamic. You no longer needed to be chosen to feel whole. And that realization dismantles any strategy built on emotional withholding. What's crucial here is this. You didn't leave to reclaim power over them. You left to reclaim power over yourself. And that's why it worked. Pow. Ear that is taken invites resistance. Power that is embodied creates consequence. Your absence became the consequence, not as punishment, but as truth. And here's the final layer. When someone realizes they were never in control, only temporarily accommodated, it forces humility, or defensiveness, or avoidance. But it always leaves a mark. Because once a person sees that another human being can choose self-respect over proximity, they can never unsee it. You didn't expose their loss of control by confronting them. You exposed it by becoming uncontrollable. When you were present, they could avoid themselves. That's the part people rarely talk about. Your presence wasn't just companionship, it was cover. It gave them movement, distraction, and emotional noise to hide behind. As long as you were there responding, adapting, waiting, or hoping, they never had to sit still with their own inner landscape. But the moment you left, that buffer disappeared. And what replaced it was something far more confronting than conflict, reflection. Avoidants are often masters of outward functioning. They can stay productive, composed, even charming, but internally they rely on external dynamics to regulate what they haven't learned to face alone. Your emotional availability, your patience, your willingness to hold space allowed them to keep unresolved parts of themselves just out of view, not consciously, not manipulatively, but effectively. And when that dynamic ended, the silence didn't feel empty. Why? It felt exposing. Your absence removed the distraction. No messages to delay. No emotional signals to interpret at a distance. No relational tension to manage on their terms. What remained was stillness. And stillness is intolerable when someone has never been taught how to be with their own emotions without escaping them. That's why this phase feels so uncomfortable for avoidance. It's not heartbreak in the traditional sense, it's confrontation. Psychologically, your absence functions like a mirror. Without your reactions, their behavior has nothing to bounce off of. There's no one to absorb inconsistency, no one to normalize emotional withdrawal, no one to keep the narrative intact, so the mind turns inward. And inward is exactly where avoidants have learned not to go. Because inward is where unmet needs, unresolved grief, and unexamined fear live. Here's the deeper layer. When you were in their life, they could unconsciously outsource emotional responsibility. If things felt distant or disconnected, the tension lived between you. Once you were gone, that tension had nowhere else to exist. It had to settle inside them. And that's when the familiar defenses, intellectualizing, minimizing, rationalizing, start to fail. Because the problem is no longer relational, it's personal. Philosophically, this is the moment where avoidance loses its function. Avoidance only works when there is something external to avoid through. Another person, another dynamic, another situation. But when you remove yourself cleanly, there's nothing left to hide behind. The self becomes unavoidable. And for someone who built safety around emotional distance, that's deeply unsettling. This is often when avoidants experience what looks like sudden insight. Not growth yet, but awareness. They start to notice patterns they previously dismissed. They replay moments not to blame you, but to understand themselves. And that's uncomfortable because it destabilizes the identity they've relied on. The story of being independent, low maintenance, or just not emotional begins to crack when confronted with the reality of internal unrest. And notice something important here. You didn't demand this reflection. You didn't accuse them. You didn't force a reckoning. You simply removed your energy. And energy removal is one of the most powerful psychological interventions there is. Because without resistance, without explanation, the mind is forced to supply its own meaning. That's why your absence felt louder than any argument. Arguments can be won, dismissed, or reframed. Silence that comes from self-respect can't. It sits, it lingers, it invites questions with no immediate answers. And those questions echo precisely because they weren't imposed. They emerged naturally. This is also why avoidants often struggle after these endings in ways they can't articulate. They may feel restless, irritable, or oddly preoccupied. Not because they want the relationship back in the old form, but because they lost the mirror that was quietly holding their unresolved parts at bay. You didn't just leave their life, you removed the emotional buffer that made avoidance comfortable. So understand this. You didn't break them by leaving. You revealed them. You didn't take something away that belonged to them. You stopped carrying something that was never yours to hold. And when you did, they were left face to face with themselves for perhaps the first time. You didn't become their mirror by confronting them. You became their mirror by walking away and letting the silence reflect the truth. One of the most profound shifts that happened when you didn't fight back was invisible on the surface, but seismic underneath. You changed the way they perceived your value, not because you tried to prove it, not because you demanded recognition, but because you stopped offering yourself without reciprocity. And in avoidant dynamics, that single move recalibrates everything. Avoidants don't consciously devalue people. What they do is become accustomed to emotional availability without emotional cost. When someone stays through inconsistency, mixed signals, and emotional distance, the avoidant nervous system learns a quiet lesson: connection is guaranteed, even when effort is minimal. Over time, that familiarity creates complacency, not disrespect and intention, but an impact. The bond begins to feel secure not because it's healthy, but because it's unchallenged. When you walked away without chasing, something broke that familiarity. Suddenly, your presence was no longer a constant, it became a loss. And the human mind assigns value differently to what is lost than to what is always available. This isn't manipulation, it's psychology. Value is clarified by consequence. And until that moment, there had been very little consequence for emotional withdrawal. What truly changed their perception wasn't your absence alone, it was the absence of pursuit. You didn't try to reestablish contact. You didn't attempt to stay emotionally relevant at a distance. You didn't position yourself as an option waiting to be reconsidered. That silence communicated something unmistakable. Your life was not on hold, and that message carries weight, especially to someone who unconsciously relied on being the emotional center while remaining detached. From a psychological standpoint, chasing and avoidant dynamics doesn't increase closeness, it decreases perceived value. Not because you are worth less, but because pursuit reassures the avoidant that they can remain unavailable without risk. When that pursuit stops, the equation flips. The mind is forced to reevaluate. If they didn't chase, maybe I misjudged how much they were willing to tolerate. And here's the part that stings for avoidance. Your decision to leave reclassified you from someone who would always be there into someone who chose themselves. That's a dramatic shift. The brain treats those two categories very differently. The first feels safe, predictable, non-threatening. The second feels significant, because significance implies agency, and agency introduces uncertainty. Philosophically, this is where dignity re-enters the picture. You didn't elevate your value by demanding better treatment. You elevated it by refusing to participate in a dynamic that required self-abandonment. And dignity is felt long before it's understood. It's sensed in the absence of resentment, in the lack of explanation, in the calm withdrawal that says, this no longer aligns with who I am. That kind of exit doesn't provoke anger, it provokes reevaluation. Avoidance may not articulate it, but internally, the narrative shifts. They start replaying moments where your presence felt stabilizing, grounding, or real. Not because you were perfect, but because you were consistent. And consistency becomes more visible in its absence. This is why avoidants often romanticize the partner who didn't chase after the relationship ended. Not because they want the old dynamic back, but because that person represents a boundary they didn't anticipate. You became a reference point for what self-respect looks like. And once someone sees that, they can't unknow it. Notice something important here. You didn't raise your value by becoming cold. You didn't punish them with silence. You simply redirected your energy back to yourself. And that's the difference. Coldness creates resentment. Self-respect creates impact. One invites defensiveness. The other invites reflection. Your departure forced a recalibration because it removed the illusion that access to you was unlimited. And when access is no longer guaranteed, the mind assigns weight. Suddenly, your absence carried meaning. Not drama, meaning. And meaning is what lingers. So if you ever wondered whether leaving quietly mattered, this is your answer. It mattered because it told the truth without argument. It said, I know my worth and I will not dilute it to be chosen. And that truth doesn't fade with time, it deepens. You didn't become valuable because you left. You became undeniable because you finally chose yourself. What ultimately landed the hardest wasn't that you left, it was why you left. You didn't walk away to teach them a lesson. You didn't leave to trigger regret, jealousy, or fear. You left because something inside you reached clarity. And clarity is the one thing an avoidant nervous system cannot negotiate with, manipulate, or delay. That's why this ending felt different. It wasn't reactive, it was resolved. Avoidants are used to emotional exits that are charged. Arguments, ultimatums, cycles of breaking up and reconnecting. Those exits keep the bond psychologically alive. They leave emotional threads hanging. But your departure carried a different frequency. It didn't say, see what you lost. It said, I'm no longer abandoning myself. And that shift changes everything. Psychologically, this is where the deepest disruption occurs. Avoidants often unconsciously rely on ambiguity. As long as the other person is emotionally unsettled, there is room to return, to reframe, to reinterpret the past. But when someone leaves with self-respect, ambiguity collapses. There is no confusion to hide in, no emotional chaos to absorb the responsibility. The ending feels clean, and clean endings force truth. The truth they are left with is uncomfortable. You didn't leave because they were unlovable. You left because the dynamic required you to be smaller, quieter, or less emotionally alive than you were meant to be. And that realization cuts deeper than rejection. Rejection can be externalized. This cannot, because your choice was inward-facing. It was about alignment, not them. From a philosophical standpoint, this is the moment where agency becomes undeniable. You didn't react to their behavior. You responded to your values, and values-based decisions carry a gravity that emotional reactions do not. They don't invite debate. They don't escalate. They simply stand. And standing in your values communicates something profound. I trust myself more than I fear losing you. That's what destabilizes the avoidant internal world, because avoidants often believe connection requires compromise of self. They expect people to trade authenticity for proximity. When you refuse that trade, you reveal a different model of relating. 1W. Here, closeness is not purchased through self-erasure, and that model challenges the very framework they've been living inside. Your exit wasn't loud, but it was final. Not because you closed the door aggressively, but because you closed it consciously. And conscious endings are hard to reopen. They don't carry emotional residue. They don't leave room for reinterpretation. They don't linger in fantasy. They land in reality. This is why the impact shows up later, not immediately. At first, they may intellectualize it, minimize it, tell themselves it was mutual or inevitable. But over time, one truth keeps resurfacing. You didn't disappear. You moved forward. And movement is something avoidants struggle with when it requires emotional presence. Your growth became the quiet consequence, not as a performance, not as proof, but as fact. And facts don't argue. They simply exist. Watching someone thrive without bitterness, without needing validation, without rewriting the past to justify their peace, that forces reflection. Because it removes the narrative that you were too emotional or too much. Instead, it reveals that you were simply unwilling to stay disconnected from yourself. Here's the most important thing to understand. You didn't save yourself at their expense. You saved yourself from self-abandonment. And that's why this ending holds weight. Because self-abandonment is the unspoken cost of many avoidant relationships. When you stopped paying that cost, the relationship couldn't continue. You didn't leave to be remembered. You left to be whole. And wholeness is the one thing they never saw coming. What this entire journey comes down to is not them, it's you. Not what they failed to give, not what they couldn't face, not what they avoided. It's the moment you stopped negotiating your worth and started honoring it. You didn't win by proving anything. You didn't heal by being chosen. You healed by choosing yourself. You didn't fight back because you finally understood something deeper than attachment. You understood alignment. You realized that love without presence is not love, that connection without respect is not intimacy, and that staying in a place where you have to abandon yourself is not loyalty. It's self-betrayal. And once that realization settles in, there is no argument strong enough to pull you back into who you used to be. What broke the dynamic wasn't your absence, it was your clarity. Avoidants can manage emotions, distance, and conflict. What they can't manage is someone who no longer needs their permission to move forward. When you left calmly, you removed the illusion, the leverage, and the emotional ambiguity. You ended the pattern by stepping out of it. And here's the truth that matters most. You didn't leave to hurt them. You didn't leave to be remembered. You left because you reached a point where self-respect became non-negotiable. That decision doesn't just end relationships, it ends cycles. It rewires what you will and will not tolerate. It becomes the standard you carry forward. So if there's one thing to take with you from this entire story, let it be this. Walking away in peace is not a loss. It's a declaration that you will no longer shrink to maintain connection, a declaration that love must meet you where you are, not where you abandon yourself to be chosen. You didn't fight back, you didn't beg, you didn't chase, you left, and in leaving, you didn't lose them. You finally found yourself